back to our course on high temperature materials. Now, this course or this lecture rather would be different in two ways. One, this is our first lecture away from the introductory module. So far, the lectures have largely been confined to the introductory aspect of the high temperature materials. But this lecture is the one wherein we try to move away from the introduction and get little deeper into the subject of high temperature materials. Now, the other aspect that would be different about this lecture is, as you can see, this lecture will no longer be presented based on a presentation or a PPT. This would be a rather conventional chalk and talk or an upgraded version of it. So instead of using chalk or a board, I'll be using a digital writing pad, which at least for me is like writing on a glass. So this lecture will be more me writing and talking, and as usual, you guys listening. Now, at the very preface, I just want to clarify one thing. You have to bear with me in this lecture because, like I said, this writing on this digital pad is something new for me, and at times my writing or the content of the lecture might not be legible to you. So at that moment, I would have to go back and to rewrite it so that to make it more understandable for you. So please bear with me there. And if there are other interruptions with the technological aspect of things, please bear with me. So without much of a delay or further ado, let's get into the lecture. Now, in this lecture, the question that is often posed to us will be answered. That the one question is that especially when you raise the temperature of the material, what is the reason behind the material behaves differently? Why should a material behave in a different manner when you raise the temperature of a material? Now, one standard answer to that question, like specifically you can talk about the material or how much temperature when you raise it, how you changes, all those specific you can answer with regards to the material, with regards to the temperature, with regards to the environment. You can answer the question why a material behaves in the way it behaves at a particular temperature in a particular environment. You can answer all those questions in a specific manner. But there is one fundamental answer to that question that underpins everything, and which in most cases is not wrong. So that rather black box of an answer or a skeletal key of an answer is when you raise the temperature of a material, what you impart is energy to the material, and this imparted energy drives whatever changes we subsequently see in the material. So to put it simply, when you heat a material, the energy of the material increases, and that is the reason why the material behaves the way it behaves. In most of the cases, this answer, though it is general, is not always wrong. So here in this lecture, we want to see what is the theoretical underpinning. When we say the energy of the material increases with the temperature, in this lecture we will try to quantify it, particularly with respect to solids, as we are interested in that. Now, one of the changes that a material experiences when you heat it is that it changes its states. It changes its state either from solid to liquid, or it changes its state from vaporizes from liquid and it becomes gas. So in this way it happens. If this change in state is something that we want or it is desirous to us, then we would say that heat enables this change in state. But if it is not desirous to us, it happens as a side effect of heat, then we just call it as the heat the energy that we input or put into the system through the heat or the rise in temperature. The energy is fed into the system through the rise in temperature, forces the material to change its state. Now, when you hear the term state or change in state, when you hear the term system, you could fairly recollect what was the subject that first introduced to us these terminologies. As a student of metallurgical and materials engineering, these terminologies, system, state, were first introduced to us in the framework of thermodynamics. or Introduction to Thermodynamics of Materials. Now let us also begin this discussion or this lecture with this from the standpoint of thermodynamics. Now the point where the temperature as a factor was introduced to us in the thermodynamic framework was when we studied a change of a system from one state to another. So let us begin by considering one of the experiment that was introduced to us in the thermodynamic framework in order to explain a change in state. This experiment is referred to as Joule's experiment, wherein we consider a system that is adiabatic in nature. So this is the system. Again, like I said, let me reiterate, please pardon me, my drawings won't be that pretty. Had it been in a board, I could have made it more legible, but this is a digital writing pad and I'm new to it. So I will make it as legible as possible. Whenever the inaccuracies in the drawing are more technical, I will try to redraw it. If not, I will just leave it as it is. So let's get back to our talking point on the experiment wherein a system changes from one state to another. So this experiment is referred to as Joule's experiment. And in this experiment, we consider an adiabatic system, meaning the heat is not allowed to pass through the walls of this vessel or this system. So we don't allow the heat to pass through. The heat does not pass through the walls of the system. And now when we do some work on the system, supposing you have some pedals here and you try to pedal it, and what we do is we work on the system, and now it can be said that after a while the system changes its states. Now how do we know that system has changed its state? And the factor that indicates this change in state of the system is nothing but our temperature T. So in the thermodynamic framework, the temperature was first exposed to us when we wanted to study how a system changes from one state to another, and the factor that showed us the system has changed from one state to another is the temperature. So when we see a rise in the temperature, particularly in an adiabatic system wherein there is no possible way of heat to pass through, when the temperature of the system rises because of the work that you have done, then we say that the state of the system has moved from one to another. Now to indicate this change in state, we use the factor called temperature. Now even though temperature is a factor, in order to express this change in state as a function, we introduce the term internal energy, which we commonly refer to it as U. So this U is the internal energy, which is nothing but a function that defines the state of the system. And when a system changes from one state to another, that means that is delta U. When it changes from one state to another, that means that there is a change in the internal energy, and that can be seen by the difference in the internal energy. So the temperature was introduced to us as an indicator to show there is a change in the state of the system, and to quantify this change in state, the function was introduced, and that function was internal energy, and this difference in the internal energy is quantified as it quantifies the change in state. Now in this setup we saw a work being done. So this work causes a change in the internal energy, and since there is not much of a heat flow here, the work is the only cause for the change in the internal energy. Now if we have a system like a system wherein we allow the heat to pass through and there is also a work that is happening, then the change in the internal energy is expressed as a difference in the heat that passes through the system or that is fed into a system minus the work done by the system. So this is an expression for the change in an internal energy of the system wherein there is work involved and also there is heat involved. So this component talks about the heat, and this term here talks about the work that is done by the system. Now this combination of these two, the heat and the work, then enables us to express the change in the internal energy of the system or the change in the state of the system. Now this heat can be related to the indicator temperature. Again, that heat that we feed into the system can be related to the temperature change in the system by what we know as specific heat capacity. This heat capacity can be expressed in different ways depending on the constant volume assumption or constant pressure assumption. The heat capacity or the expression for it changes. But for the sake of this discussion, let us assume a simple definition, which how one can relate the heat and the temperature. So a simple or rather generalized expression for the heat capacity is something like this: delta Q by dt. So the amount of heat that is required to change the temperature of a system to a definite amount is what we call as heat capacity. Now this heat capacity, even though it has this sort of a textbook definition, for the sake of this discussion, we can call this heat capacity as a term that relates heat to the temperature. Heat, that is the energy that we feed in, to the temperature, that the visible factor that changes when we feed in the heat. Now let me try to create a new page. Yeah, okay. So the heat capacity is the term that now, as I was saying, it relates Q and T. Now this change in the internal energy or the minimalistic change of this can be written, or a small change in the internal energy can be written or usually written in this way. Now we have to write, I want to introduce you to this minimalistic change in the internal energy because I want to make sure or explain myself why I have used a different delta here and D here. So in order to explain that, let us get back to this expression here. So we know that the change in the internal energy comes from the heat fed into the system and the work done by the system. And now a minimalistic change in the internal energy, that is du, can be written as a small change in the heat that is introduced into the system and the work done by the system. So the expression remains the same. But this small change in each of these factors is expressed by d and delta. This is because the internal energy is nothing but change in the internal energy is nothing but the difference between the two internal energies of different states. Let me make it clear. If you have a system that moves from one state to another, the change in the internal energy is nothing but the difference in the internal energy pertaining to each of the state. If you have a system that moves from state 1 to state 2, and they have two different internal energies, and the difference is nothing but the difference in the internal energy. It does not depend on the way the system moves from one state to another. So since this internal energy is a state function, we express this in du way, or the d represents means that the u is the term next to it is a state function, and it is nothing. It just depends on the state of the system, and thus we have expressed it by the difference of the internal energy, and this difference in the internal energy now is equal to the combination of heat and work, which are not the state function but rather a path function. The amount of heat that is entered and that enters into the system, or amount of work that is done by the system or done on the system, depends on the path that it takes. So it just does not depend on the state of the system, like state A to state B, but it depends on the path we take from state A to state B. I believe that these fundamental concepts have already been introduced to you in the introduction to thermodynamic class, but since we are recollecting it, I want to make the expressions that we use consistent with your understanding, and also to make sure that you are able to recollect the same notations, and that is the reason why I am giving you this explanation. So what we have here is the internal energy is a state function, and that's the term. That's why we represented the internal energy or the change of it in this format. While since the heat and the work are path function, we use delta to indicate their changes. Okay. Now we have related the change in heat to the temperature. The change in heat has been related to the temperature through the specific heat. Now, in a system, or when we talk about work done by the system or work done on a system, the simplest way of representing it is assuming the pressure is constant, and the system changes from one state to another, and we include as parts, so we do the integral of it, and we have an expression like this for the work done by or on the system. So work done is expressed in this format wherein there is a change in the volume. So what we ultimately have is we have heat that can be expressed as a function of temperature and work that can be expressed as a function of volume. So ultimately the change in the internal energy or the internal energy as a function is dependent on temperature and volume. And for the sake of the present lecture, if you assume the volume to be constant, the internal energy of a system is totally or purely exclusively dependent on the temperature. So when you say you raise the material or the temperature of a material, when we increase the temperature of a material, what we are ultimately doing is we are playing around with this internal energy. According to the temperature that you raise, the internal energy of the system changes. Now this so far what we have been talking is nothing but the first law of the thermodynamics. Now when we talk about how the change in the internal energy with respect to these components we express it in this format by using the chain rule. So we have a change in the internal energy with respect to volume, assuming that the temperature is constant, and the change in the internal energy with respect to temperature, assuming that the volume is constant. So this is how we express the change in the internal energy. And for this lecture, if we assume that there is not much change or there is no change in the volume of the system, then what you end up having is that the change in the internal energy is dependent exclusively on the change in temperature. So the first law of thermodynamics for our arguments gives us the idea that, or it gives us the theoretical understanding that internal energy changes with the temperature. When you increase the temperature of a system, what happens is the change in the internal energy. So whatever subsequently happens to the system, be it a phase change, be it a change in its mechanical behavior, whatever it may be, what undergirds is that the change in the internal energy of the system because of the temperature propels all the other changes. So this is one of the general answers that we can extract or derive from the first law of thermodynamics. But the first law of thermodynamics does not allow us to quantify the change in the internal energy when you raise the temperature of the material. It just gives us an expression, or it just gives us an idea of theoretical foundation stating that when you raise the temperature of a material, there is a change in the internal energy. But it does not quantify how much of a change an internal energy experiences when you raise the temperature. For that, we have to look elsewhere. We have to go a little bit away from the thermodynamics. Now, when you go a little bit away from the thermodynamics, the internal energy, which was introduced to us as a function that enables us to define or realize the change in the state of a system, changes and a new definition is rendered to us. Now, according to this new definition of internal energy, the internal energy of the system is nothing but the sum of kinetic energy and potential energy of all the components that are involved in a system. Now, if we take a system and this system comprises, or you can divide that system into individual components. Let's just say if you take a pure element, a metal, and say iron, the components of the system are its atoms, and now the internal energy of this iron is nothing but the summation of kinetic and potential energy of all the components of the system, that is the iron atoms. So when you sum up the kinetic and potential energies of the atom that consist or that builds this iron system, if you sum up all the energy contributions of the individual atoms that comprise a material, then what you end up with is the internal energy. So this internal energy then comprises of kinetic and a potential term. Now, this kinetic term, it generally comprises of three components. So this kinetic term, or the kinetic energy of a component in a system. So this component can be atom, molecule, ions. Depending on the system, it may vary, but for the sake of argument, let us assume that this component is atom. So the kinetic energy of the atom, of an atom, can be, or three factors or three different energies contribute to the kinetic energy of the atom. One of the energy is translational energy, so I denote it as Ki trans, and one is Ki rotational energy, and Ki vibrational. So there are three types of energies that totally or that contribute cumulatively to the kinetic energy of one single atom. These are translational kinetic energy, rotational kinetic energy, and vibrational kinetic energy. So what I mean by translational kinetic energy is when your atom is free enough to move around, then the translational kinetic energy is it is derived from the movement of the atom along a straight line. This movement may be random, but if the movement is in the straight line, then based on its path, we can then define the translational kinetic energy. This is typically observed in fluids, gases, and liquids, wherein the atoms have sufficient space to move around. And since the movement is the primary factor that defines the translational kinetic energy, we will see that this kinetic energy, this energy doesn't play much of a role when you define kinetic energy of an atom in a solid system. Okay, so the translational kinetic energy, it depends on the random movement of the atom. When your atom has enough room to move around, not just vibrate or wiggle, but move around with respect to the atomic size, which is allowed to move around, then you can calculate based on its movement a translational energy, which ultimately contributes to the kinetic energy. I want to make one other thing clear. I might be repeating the particular concept over and over again. This is primarily because I'm not able to see your faces, and I am not very sure that you have understood the concept or not. So till I am convinced that I have delivered it clearly, I will be talking about it more than once. So again, please bear with me here. Maybe in the upcoming semester, wherein we meet ourselves face to face, at that time maybe I will be able to reduce it, but as of now there might be instances where I will be like going over a particular concept again and again, so please bear with me when I do that. Maybe for some it might help them to understand or get a deeper understanding. Okay, so let's get back to other energies that contribute to the kinetic energy here. So the other energy that contributes is the rotational energy, as the name in itself suggests that this is when the atoms are allowed to rotate or evolve. Then this would introduce a new dimension to the kinetic energy, and this is what we refer to as rotational energy. And again, these are something that are associated with fluids, solid, liquids and gases, not particularly in solids. At least the solids that we would be concerned with, we won't be focusing much on this rotational kinetic energy. The only factor or the major energy that contributes to the kinetic energy in solids is the vibrational kinetic energy, because even though we have a specific position for an atom in a crystalline structure, we have a specific position for an atom, there is a room for these atoms to wiggle. There is room for this atom to vibrate. And this vibration stops only when you are in absolute zero. And if you move away from the absolute zero, which is 0 Kelvin, there is some sort of a vibration that is exhibited by the atoms, even though it sits in a specific place in a crystalline structure, particularly in solid. You see this vibration, and this vibration, using this or based on this vibration, we define our vibrational energy, and that would contribute to the kinetic energy, and this would be the major contributing energy in solids to the kinetic energies of the atom. So just to recap, what we have here is we have defined now the internal energy as the combination of kinetic and potential energy, and now the kinetic energy we have seen it comprises of three energies that contribute to the kinetic energies, and we have seen that the translational, that is Ki translational and rotational. These are something that is confined or play a major role in only in fluids, that is gas and liquids. So they don't play much of a role in solids. So the overall kinetic energy of an atom in a solid is then largely dependent on the vibrational energy of the atom in the solids. So this is a future of understanding the internal energy of solids. So we don't have translational and rotational energy playing any role, and the only kinetic energy comes from the vibration of the atoms in the crystalline framework. Now let's talk about the potential energy, because after all the overall overall internal energy of the system involves all the component I and its kinetic energy and potential energy. So let us now talk about the potential energy. The potential energy is dependent on the position of the atom. Now when I say x vector, I mean I include the x and y, x, y, z coordinates of a point. So when I talk about the position of the atom in as an x vector, that means I'm talking about a point in a 3-dimension. So the potential energy of the system in a 3-dimension depends on the position of the potential energy of the atom rather in a system depends on the position of the atom. Now the position of the atom, or how the position of the atom translates itself to the potential energy, can be explained when you consider pairwise interaction of the atoms. Supposing you have two atoms and they interact, and they are separated by some distance and they interact, and based on this interaction between the two atoms, or this is called as pairwise interaction, based on the interaction between two atoms, we can then extrapolate it to the interaction of a large number of atoms. For our understanding, let's consider this pairwise interaction. Now what I mean by interaction is that the atoms at the subatomic level, they comprise of positively charged or neutrally charged neutrons, negatively charged electrons, and positively charged subatomic particles. And now these particles, because of their charges, they either attract or they either repel. So we have proton and we have neutron that form the nucleus, and nucleus is then the resulting charge of the nucleus is positive. Then we have electron, which is negative, and the nature of its charge is negative. Now the same setup is found in the neighboring atom. Now the dissimilar charges, that is electron of one atom and the nucleus of the other atom, they attract each other, but the similar charges like nucleus, and electron, they repel each other. Because of these interaction, we have the potential energy as a whole, which is dependent on the position, is resultant of these interactions. Now let us assume, like for the sake of this discussion, let us assume a one-dimensional setup and describe the potential energy of the atom in the one-dimensional setup. At least graphically, let us see how the potential energy of the atoms varies in a one-dimensional setup when you have the interaction between the subatomic particles of similar and dissimilar charges. Now since now we are going to talk about one dimension, now we can lose the vector notation for the position and write the potential energy as this. So we have since this means that we are talking about one dimension, or to be even more precise, that we want to talk about the potential at the x-axis, we can rewrite the potential energy as this. And again, since it's a one dimension, we need only one coordinate, and that coordinate is x-axis, and we write the potential in this way. Now the potential energy in one dimension can be graphically plotted by allow me to add one more page. Now the potential energy of a system with respect to in one dimension can be plotted by considering the distance between the two atoms. Now the potential energy of an atom I in the x-axis, depending on the distance between the atoms, which is then, since it is in one dimension, we just have to consider one axis, so along the x-axis. when the potential energy of these atoms, it is governed exclusively by the force of repulsion between the two nucleus of the atoms, or the force of repulsion between the two negatively charged particles of the atom, then graphically this change in the potential energy with respect to the distance can be expressed in this form. What I mean by that is, when you get closer and closer, this is the x-axis, when two atoms get closer and closer, because of the similar charges that is present between the subatomic particles, the potential energy, when you just consider the force of repulsion, it increases tremendously and reaches infinite when we get more closer to each other. Like the force of repulsion, we also have the force of attraction between the dissimilar atoms, and this force of attraction would have a similar trend but in the negative direction. Because this is a force of attraction, we have something like this. This is because the subatomic particles which have that have different that have dissimilar charges, they attract each other, and this force of attraction renders us a potential energy of something like this. So these two graphs, what we have here is the potential energy when you exclusively consider the force of repulsion. The position based potential energy in one dimension when you exclusively consider attraction. Now, since the atom is a neutrally charged particle, and the potential energy should then include both attraction and repulsion, the overall energy, the change in the potential energy when you move two atoms closer or away from each other, or the change in the potential energy with respect to the difference or distance between the atoms in one dimension, that is x. So when you have two atoms separated by the distance by a distance x, and the change in the potential energies of the atoms exclusively because of the force of attraction and repulsions that we have seen here because of the subatomic particles along the x-axis, is the combination of these two plots, which is expressed something as, which is expressed something like this. So this is a smooth curve. This is not rather a sharp one. Maybe I could just try to do that. Oh yeah. So this is a smooth curve, and the combination of attraction and repulsion renders us this curve, which is nothing but the potential energy because of the pairwise interaction of the two atoms. And when we bring these atoms close to one another, there is a point which is equilibrium on the lowest energy state, and if you try to bring it even more closer, then the potential energy is increases, and it is no longer stable. So this is the potential energy of an atom I, depending exclusively on its position. And now we have expressed it in terms of taking a single dimension, and since we have taken a single dimension, we have not considered the overall potential energy of we have not considered this, but rather, this is a vector notation, but rather we have considered one component of a potential energy of an atom I, one component of a potential energy of an atom I, the x component of it, by considering a one-dimensional setup of x. So we have considered not the overall potential energy of an atom, but one component of an atom, and we have found that we get a wonderful plot like this. Now let us try to build on this and try to derive an expression for the potential energy of the atom based on its position. We will try to derive get an expression for the potential energy of the atom. First, we will try to get an expression for the one component of it. Then, since the other components, we can assume that given we are talking about a crystalline system, we can assume that the other components also behave in a similar manner, and based on the expression, we can extrapolate our results. So now we have a curve like this, a smooth curve like this, and this is the equilibrium position of the atom. Now, if you could recall, moments before I told you that an atom, even though it is in its equilibrium position, it vibrates once you move away from the absolute temperature or absolute zero. When you move away from the absolute zero or 0 Kelvin, the atom gains some energy because of the temperature and it begins to vibrate. So that means the atom moves from its equilibrium position or lowest potential energy position and it starts to vibrate. It moves in the x-axis, it moves in this way or the other. Now we want to express this potential, the component of the potential in the x-axis of the atom I in the one dimension x as a function. Now this is, as you can see, is a smooth function and we want to focus in an area where there is the vibration of the atom. So instead of considering the whole of this curve, we can now focus a area something like this. So allow me to plot it again. So we have a curve something like this, or maybe I will move to a different page so that I can draw it in a larger scale. Or yeah, okay. So we have a curve something like this, and this is your distance, and this is the potential energy. This would be your potential energy. And now we have equilibrium position of the atom here, the least energy state or the lowest point. And now we want to consider the vibration of this atom around this equilibrium state. It has a state, it has a position. This equilibrium position is vibrating, and we have to consider that, we have to quantify, or we have to define the potential energy based including this vibration. So let us try to plot or approximate the curve in this region. We will try to approximate the curve in this region. So this is the curve we will be trying to approximate. That would include this lowest energy point, and we want to approximate this curve. So this is nothing but a parabolic curve. If you could look into it, we will get rid of this region as they are away from the vibration zone. We will also get rid of this region as they are also away from the vibration zone, and we end up with some sort of approximated parabola. And that is the part of this. We can approximate a parabola, from the part of this curve, and we can derive, or we can plot it something like this. Now, how can we express? Okay, it's easy to geometrically imagine that the close to this point, close to this equilibrium point, there will be some sort of a symmetric parabola, and we can zoom in and take that parabola out. It is that is what we have been doing, and it is fairly easy to imagine zooming in and taking the parabola out. It's fairly easy to imagine. Now, how can we describe it? How can we render an expression for it? And that is where Taylor's series comes into play. Now, I hope you are acquainted with, or at least in some of the numeric class or Max 1 or Max 2 or Max 3, those classes or classes on calculus, you have been exposed to the Taylor series. If not, it's not a problem. What Taylor series helps us is to express a function based on a particular spot. If you know a function or a derivative of a function at a particular spot, based on that spot, you can try to approximate the whole of the function. Now, in this spot, we know it is the lowest energy spot, and we can assume, we can say that we also know the first derivative of this function, the whole of this function of potential energy at this spot. So let us begin by trying to write a function for the potential energy of an atom I in one dimension. So the function for the potential energy of an atom I, the x component of it in one dimension. Now this can be written by considering this region here, or this spot here, which is the low energy spot. Now the low energy space, based on this, we will try to write this expression or expand this expression. So this is nothing but the component of potential energy along the x-axis of the atom I at x naught, which is the lowest point here, or the state, minimum energy state of the atom. And now we need to include all the terms that surround it. So we do that by taking the derivative of this function at this spot. So this particular potential here just considers this point here. the lowest point is what we have expressed here. Now we have to also consider the segments that join, the segments of the parabola that are connected to this minimum or the minimum energy point. Now for that we try to take the derivative of the function at that spot. Now it would be d psi, the derivative of the potential energy of the component or x component of the potential energy at the point, the minimum most point, wherein the atom experience the minimal potential energy. And now there should be the difference between the point that you are considering and the minimum most point. Now we can also consider the second derivative of it, because in this expression the more additional terms or the more derivatives or more higher order terms as it is called, the more higher order terms that you include, the more accurate your approximation of the plot would be. So we will consider a second order term. We will take the second derivative of the potential energy or the x component of the potential energy along the x-axis at the minimal point as shown here, and now we will take the difference in the point. So this is nothing but we have expressed the function for the potential energy in a Taylor format. We have expanded or we have derived or we have expressed the function for the x component of the potential energy of atom I using Taylor series. We have taken the potential energy at the minimum most point, and we have considered the first derivative of the x component of the potential energy at that point and included the distance separating from it from the neighboring points. And we have also taken the second order term, and we have included the square of the other terms that are associated with it. And there are other higher order terms which we can write it in this way. Now it is important to note that this curve, as we zoom in closer, it is important to note that this curve resembles a parabolic curve when you zoom more into it, and which is symmetric in nature. So that would mean that we can stop with the second order term, and that would give us a rather fair approximation of the potential energy in this around this spot. So again, the reason we are concerned about the potential energy around the minimal is because it is around the minimal or the equilibrium point the atoms vibrate. Now we want to understand the potential energy of the atoms during this vibration. This vibration, it will not be so large that it will move to this region or to this region. It will not be that large. It will be, when you compare to the position, it will be very small, and we have to just zoom in and just consider a small fraction of this curve around the minimal or the absolute minima here. What we have to do is zoom in and consider just a part of this curve, and all we have to do is define the potential energy around this region or in this region. So that is what we have done. We have considered the minimal most point, and we have around this minimal most point or around this minima, we have expressed the x component of the potential energy around this minima by using Taylor series, wherein you have the derivative at the minimal most point, first and second derivative, and also the distance separating the position of the atom and the minimal most point. Now if we assume or if we have our coordinates in such a way that the minimal point or the minima is our reference, then you can simply write the function that defines the x component of the potential energy of atom I as the potential energy at the minimum or the minimum most potential energy x naught plus the first derivative at x equal to x naught plus the second derivative again at x equal to x naught with x square by 2. Now we are planning, we will neglect all the higher order terms because we want the shape that fortunately for us is a parabola. So just this second order term would give us a pretty decent approximation. So we can just ignore this higher order terms, and the rest would be a good approximation for the x component of the potential energy based on its position in one dimension. Now, so the one thing that we have done here is we have removed the position of the minimal most position here from the difference here, because now we can assume that the minimal most position is our frame of reference. Now here the first derivative of what we are talking about in this term, that is the first derivative d here. So what actually we are considering it when we consider the first derivative of the curve at its minimal most point is that its slope at this minimal most point, which is nothing but 0. So at the minimal most point, the first derivative is 0. So we can consider that this whole term is 0, or therefore this whole term is 0, because at the x naught, what we are defining our first derivative based on is nothing but the absolute minima, and the first derivative is 0. So that means, please allow me to add another page. That means the expression then becomes the x component of potential energy at the minima, and now the first derivative term has vanished. Now we have the second derivative term. It's not with respect to at the position of the minima, and then we have x square by 2. If you are so far bearing with me, please bear a little while. We are nearing the end of this function. Now this term here, the second derivative of it, you can just play around with it, in the sense that if you want to plot a parabola, and now if you want to change the steepness of the parabola, all you have to do is you have to increase the second derivative of the parabola. So what I mean by that is, second derivative of a parabolic function is a constant, and it defines the steepness of the curve. Let me reiterate. When you have a parabolic function, which we have approximated based on the potential energy function, when you have a such function, the second derivative of it expresses, or what it states, or what it signifies is the steepness of the curve. When you have second derivative, when the second derivative of a parabolic function is very high, it means that it is very sharp. When it is low, it means that it is quite open. So that is what I mean by the second derivative of a parabolic function is constant. Or you can also do it you can also arrive at the same result by considering the equation of a parabola. If you do two derivatives, or if you take second derivative of a parabolic function, all you end up with is a constant. So that is what I meant when I say that the second derivative of this term, which is nothing but the second derivative of the approximated parabolic function, it is a constant. So let us assume that this constant be Rx. So ultimately what we end up having is the parabolic function, or the x component of the parabolic function of an atom I along the x-axis is nothing but, it depends on the position of it is nothing but the sum of two terms. One is the potential energy at the minima or the equilibrium position, plus the constant here Rx and x square by 2. So it is, we can write it by this as the potential energy in its minimal most state plus 1 by 2 Rx x square. So again, this is where the dependency on the position comes in. This is square, not cube, it's a square. So this is rather an expression or a function for the x component of the potential energy along the x-axis. Now one can then define the overall potential energy, not just the x component, but the overall potential energy of an atom I by including all the contribution from the different axes, then it would mean that, so this term remains, which is the potential energy at the lowest spot, or the minimal most potential energy. So this would be, this would then require a vectorial notation, because in 3 dimension we have to have 3 components to define its position. So the overall position of potential energy, because of the position of the atom I, is expressed as the sum of the potential energy, the minimal most potential energy, plus 1 by 2 Rx x square plus 1 by 2 Ry y square plus 1 by 2 Rz z square. So this is the expression for, pardon me. So this is the expression for potential energy of an atom owing to its position. So it has the potential energy at its minimal most state, and it has the contribution that depend on its position. And so when the atom vibrates, when there is a change in its position, when there is a change in its coordinate, you can introduce those here, and thereby we can calculate the overall potential energy of the atom, even though it is vibrating. So we now have derived the expression for the potential energy of an atom I, while also considering its vibration. Now the potential energy or the kinetic energy, the factor that we have to consider still is the kinetic energy of the atom I. So this is fairly simple. We can write the kinetic energy of the atom I as the sum of a mass into like half mv square, and this v should have different components along the x and y and z axis. So we write it in this way. So we have x component of velocity, y component of velocity, z component of velocity, and all this, please note that these pertain to a component, pertain to an atom that is designated as I. So we have a fairly simple expression for kinetic energy, mass into square of the velocity and half of it. That means that we have a component for x, y and z, and we have a similar expression for the potential energy, but here what we have is a potential energy that is associated with with its equilibrium position, or the minimal most energy position. So now when we write the overall internal energy of an atom I, which is nothing but the summation of the potential energy and summation and the kinetic energy, so we then would write it by something like this: potential energy x naught bar. This is the minimal most potential energy. This is because of the equilibrium position of the atom. It does not vary with when it vibrates. It does not change. It is totally based on the minimal most equilibrium position of the atoms. And we have rest of these terms, which we can write here are x square, so on, plus 1 by 2 mass Vx I square, and so on. So we have a potential energy term, the term that is due to the vibration of the atoms, and the kinetic energy term that is due to the vibration of the atoms. Now, when we say we increase the temperature of a material, what we do is we attribute energy to it, and that means that we are in no way changing the equilibrium position of the atoms, but rather we are changing the amount of the vibration of the atoms. So that means what happens is that this x, y and z term, or the Vx, Vy and Vz term, are the only factor that changes when we increase the temperature of the atom. Let me reiterate. Now when I say I increase the internal energy of the atom when I increase the temperature, this component here, which is exclusively based on the equilibrium position of the atom, is not going to change. The equilibrium position of the atom for a crystal is set. But what changes is the degree of vibration changes. When the degree of vibration changes, then the x associated with this term, x, y and z associated with this term, which we have seen here, the x, y's and z's which are associated with these terms, they vary, and also the velocity along these directions, they also vary. So when I say I increase the internal energy, what I'm ultimately doing is I'm increasing the internal energy of the system by working on these factors, but not on this factor. When whatever temperature or whatever heat input that we give into the system, how much ever the temperature of the system might rise, it will not alter this equilibrium potential energy, but it will alter this potential energy and this kinetic energy. This combination of these are referred to as thermal energy. And since they are no longer dependent on dependent on a fixed position, but they are dependent on the vibration of the atom, they are also referred to as these. Both these are categorized as vibrational kinetic energy, and ultimately in solids they contribute to the kinetic energy. So what we have done so far is we have derived an expression for the potential energy or the x component of it, and that comprised of a constant term which denotes the potential energy at the lowest point, and based on because of the vibration or movement away from this minimal most point, we had an additional term in the x component of the potential energy. When you try to express or derive as overall potential energy, then we had to include y and z terms, and even in that form, even in that expression, we had a constant potential energy because of the equilibrium position of the atom, and we had potential energy exclusively because of the temperature that we introduced into the system, because this temperature allowed the atoms to oscillate or allowed the atom to move around or wiggle or vibrate with this fixed equilibrium point. It was allowed to vibrate. We had these other components, the x, y and z components of potential energy, and this x, y and z component of the potential energy, which was made possible only because of the vibration, which was made possible because of the movement, which was made possible because of the temperature, they, along with the kinetic energy of the atoms, form the thermal energy, which is nothing but a form of the vibrational energy, which ultimately contributes to the kinetic energies of the atoms in the solid crystals. Supposing if you have a system in absolute zero, that would mean that the system does not oscillate, or the atom does not oscillate, and all these other terms vanishes. These terms here would vanish off, and only term that will be available or that would be active is this one. But we are not talking about an absolute zero case. Then even the potential or the component, there are components of the potential energy that contribute to the kinetic energy, or that are active, that vary with the temperature, and they contribute to the thermal energy. So the very bottom line of this is, even though the potential energy of a system is based on the position of an atom, even though the position is the major factor for the potential energy, since the position varies due to the vibration that is introduced by the temperature also varies a component of the potential energy, and that has to be included in the thermal energy and also in the vibrational energy. So now we have an expression for this internal energy. So far we have not we have found no way to relate these components x, y and z components and the velocity components to the temperature, and this relation we can try to derive this relation, or how to translate this x, y, and z component of the position, the x, y, and z component of the velocity. How can we can try to relate that to the temperature. There is a very long derivation for it, but since at least that would be very much beyond the scope of this work, I will try to minimize this for you. I will try to just give you an outline how one can relate these positions, that is the contribution because of the position and the contributions because of the directions, how one can translate that to temperature. Maybe I will just give you an outline here. So what one needs to consider in order to get that relation, in order to translate the x components and the x components of velocity to temperature, one has to consider what nature of the vibration of atoms is in the given position. We know that atom vibrates over equilibrium position, and we need to know what the nature of the vibration is. I'm not going to talk about the equation for the vibration of the atoms. No, I'm not going to do that. But what we can say is we can assume that vibration to be harmonic vibration. So we can assume the vibration of the atom around its equilibrium position as an harmonic oscillation. When we make such an assumption, then we can invoke, or we can exploit a law of equipartition which comes from this assumption. From this harmonic oscillation assumption, we can then invoke, or we can exploit the law of equipartition that comes from the harmonic oscillation assumption, which means that the potential component, or the potential component that we have seen in the expression for the internal energy, and the kinetic component, when you take the average of it, they are equal. This is what equipartition states. The equipartition, under the assumption of harmonic oscillation, it means that when you take the average of the contribution from the kinetic energy, or the contribution from the vibrational potential energy, they are equal. So when we assume this to be equal, and they are equal to an average, and this average is equal in all the directions, so we assume this average, or we treat this average through this term, that is epsilon. So these are equal, and this is the average, and this average can be you can quantify this average, or you can derive an expression for this average contribution of the kinetic and the vibrational potential energy. We can calculate that by taking the triple integral with respect to, I'm not going to solve this, I'm trying to give an idea on how to relate, how one could relate the positions and the position related components to temperature. That is the only reason I'm trying to give an expression for this average energy here. So the average contribution of the kinetic and the potential energy, this which the equality which we assumed, which we got from the assumption of harmonic oscillation by invoking the equipartition consideration. So this average energy can be expressed by considering a triple derivative along all the three directions, wherein you have your expression for the kinetic energy, particularly in the x-axis, and a probability factor that indicates what are the probability for an atom to oscillate in this particular direction. So what you are trying to do is you are trying to find an expression for the average energy contribution, which are both vibrational potential and also kinetic. We are trying to find trying to express this average energy contribution, and this average energy contribution comprises of the expression for the kinetic energy and a probability term that shows what are the probability of an atom to oscillate in this particular direction that we are interested in, and this probability term is dependent on temperature. And now when we solve for this expression, what we ultimately end up having is this average energy contribution for the internal energy is nothing but half kappa T, where this kappa is the Boltzmann's constant. Now what we ultimately have here is the contribution of each of these individual component. So each of these individual component that ultimately translates to the thermal energy. When you want to quantify it based on temperature, this is how it translates to. Now here we have one component for the x-axis and y-axis and z-axis, and similarly the kinetic energy term for x-axis and y-axis and z-axis. So ultimately what we end up having is we have 6 terms. So when we try to include that, the overall internal energy, right, which is the sum of the equilibrium potential of the atom I plus 6 components or the 6 components that we have already seen here, each pertaining to one of the directions. We have 3 for vibration potential and 3 for kinetics, 6, and since because of the equipartitioning conditions all these contributions are equal, then we end up having something like this. So ultimately the change in the internal energy when you rise the temperature, the change in the internal energy when you rise the temperature can be expressed as T, and T here is in Kelvin, and K is the Boltzmann's constant, and delta Ui is change in the internal energy of the atom I. So this is a way to quantify the change in the internal energy when you change or depending on the change in the temperature. So when you increase this should rather be delta T, or if you want to if you want to understand how much of a change there is in the internal energy when all you do is change the temperature of the material, this can be expressed in this form. And if you could recollect, the foundation for this change in the internal energy is nothing but the increase in the vibration of the atoms around its equilibrium position. So using this expression, one can then quantify the change in the internal energy, or how much of energy is fed into the system when you increase the temperature of the system. So I know that this is a bit of more of a theoretical lecture, and maybe this is where recorded lectures might be helpful, so you can listen to it more often or listen to it at your own pace to get an understanding. But the takeaway point here is this expression, the final expression here, allows us to quantify the change in the internal energy of a system when there is a change in the temperature. Please note that here we have just considered the vibrational energy. That means this expression is confined to crystalline solids. It is not valid for liquid and gases. This expression is confined to solids. So thanks for your attention, and please let me know if you have any doubts. Good day.